Shalom, shalom, everybody. Shalom, it's your boy Shalom. We're going to go ahead with the next laws that's on the list. Law 21 and 22. The 48 laws of power. 48 laws of power. 21 and 22. Almost halfway through the book. Almost halfway. So, let's get going. Law number 21. Play a sucker to catch a sucker. Seem dumber than your mark. Try to get all my stuff. No one likes feeling stupider than the next person. The trick then is to make your victims feel smart. And not just smart, but smarter than you are. Once convinced of this, they will never suspect that you may have ulterior motives. Observance of the law. In the winter of 1872, the U.S. financier Asbury Harpending was visiting London when he received a cable. A diamond mine had been discovered in the American West. The cable came from a reliable source, William Ralston, owner of the Bank of California. Nevertheless, took it of gold being discovered in the western United States. Everyone had been skeptical, and those had turned out to be true. But a diamond mine in the West? Harpending showed the cable to his fellow financier, Baron Rothschild, one of the richest men in the world, saying it must be a joke. The Baron, however, replied, "Don't be too sure about that. America is a very large country. It has furnished the world with many surprises already. Perhaps it has others in store." Harpending promptly took the first ship back to the States. When Harpending reached San Francisco, there was an excitement in the air recalling the gold rush days of the late 1840s. Two crusty prospectors named Philip Arnold and John Slack had been the ones to find the diamond mine. They had not divulged its location in Wyoming, but had led a highly respected mining expert to it several weeks back, taking a circular route to Harpending and Ralston now asked Arnold and Slack to accompany them back to New York, where the jeweler Charles Tiffany would verify the original estimates. The prospectors responded uneasily. They smelled the trap. How could they trust these city slickers? What if Tiffany and the financiers managed to steal the whole mine out from under them? Ralston tried to allay their fears by giving them $100,000 and placing another $300,000 in escrow for them. If the deal went through, they would be paid an additional $300,000. The miners agreed. The little group traveled to New York, where a meeting was held at the mansion of Samuel L. Barlow. The cream of the city's aristocracy was in attendance. General George Britton McClellan, commander of the Union forces in the Civil War, General Benjamin Butler, Horace Greene, Harpending, Ralston, and Tiffany. Only Slack and Arnold were missing. As tourists in the city, they had decided to go sightseeing. When Tiffany announced that the gems were real and worth a fortune, the financiers could barely control their excitement. They wired Rothschild and other tycoons to tell them about the diamond mine and inviting them to share in the investment. At the same time, they also told the prospectors that they wanted one more test. They insisted that a mining expert of their choosing accompanied Slack and Arnold to the site to verify its wealth. The prospector reluctantly agreed. In the meantime, they said, they had to return to San Francisco. The jewels that Tiffany had examined, they left with Harpending for safekeeping. Several weeks later, a man named Louis Janin, the best mining expert in the country, met the prospectors in San Francisco. Janin was a born skeptic who was determined to make sure that the mine was not a fraud. Accompanying Janin was Harpending and several other interested financiers, a complex series of canyons, confusing them as to their whereabouts. Arriving at the site, the financiers watched in amazement as Janin dug the area up, leveling anthills, turning over boulders, and finding emeralds, rubies, sapphires, and most of all, diamonds. The dig lasted 8 days, and by the end, Janin was 100 men and proper machinery, he told them. I would guarantee to send out $1 million in diamonds every 30 days. Returning to San Francisco a few days later, Ralston, Harpending, and company acted fast to form a $10 million corporation of private investors. First, however, they had to get rid of Arnold and Slack. They meant hiding their excitement. That meant hiding their excitement. They certainly did not want to reveal the field's real value. So they played possum. Who knows if Janin is right? They told the prospectors. The mine may not be as rich as they think. This just made the prospectors angry. Trying a different tactic, the financiers told the two men that if they insisted on having shares in the mine, they would end up being fleeced by the unscrupulous tycoons and investors who would run the corporation. Better, they said, to take the $700,000 already offered, an enormous sum at that time, and put their greed aside. This the prospectors seemed to understand, and they finally agreed to take the money, in return signing the rights to the site over to the financiers and leaving maps to it. News of the mine spread like wildfire. Prospectors feigned out across Wyoming. Meanwhile, Harpending and group began spending the millions that they had collected from the investors, buying equipment, hiring the best men in the business, and furnishing luxurious offices in New York and San Francisco. A few weeks later, on the first trip back to the site, they learned the hard truth. Not a single diamond or ruby was to be found. It was all fake. They were ruined. Harpending had unwittingly lured the richest men in the world into the biggest scam of the century. Interpretation. Pendants. All of the experts had been real. All of them honestly believed in the existence of the mine and in the value of the gems. What had fooled them all was nothing else than Arnold and Slack themselves. The two men seemed to be such rubes, such rubes, rubes. Rubes. R-U-B-E-S. Rubes. It's not in here. The two men seemed to be such rubes, such hayseeds, so naive, that no one for an instant had believed them capable of an audacious scam. The prospectors had simply observed the law of appearing more stupid than the mark, the deceiver's first commandment. The logistics of the con were quite simple. Months before Arnold and Slack announced the discovery of the diamond mine, they traveled to Europe, where they purchased some real gems for around $12,000. Part of the money they had saved for their days in the gold mines. They then salted the mine with the gems. Because they were gold miners, they knew what to do. Which the first expert dug up and brought to San Francisco. The jewelers who had appraised these stones, including Tiffany himself, had gotten caught up in the fever and had grossly overestimated their value. Then Ralston gave the prospectors $100,000 as security, and immediately after their trip to New York, they simply went to Amsterdam, where they brought sacks of uncut gems before returning to San Francisco. The second time they salted the mine, there were many more jewels to be found. The effectiveness of the scheme, however, rested not on tricks like these, but on the fact that Arnold and Slack played their parts to perfection. On their trip to New York, where they mingled with millionaires and tycoons, they played up their clodhopper image, wearing pants and coats a size or two too small, and acting incredulous. 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 I-N-C. Incredulous. I-N-C-R-E. I-N-C-R-E-D-U-L-O-U-S. Incredulous. Not believing or skeptical. Incredulous. Not believing. Skeptical. Incredulous. 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 Wearing pants and coats a size or two too small, and acting skeptical or not believing, incredulous at everything they saw in the big city. Not one believed that these country simpletons could possibly be conning the most devious, unscrupulous financiers of the time. And once Harpending, Ralston, and even Rothschild accepted the mine's existence, anyone who doubted it was questioning the intelligence of the world's most successful businessmen. In the end, Harpending's reputation was ruined, and he never recovered. Rothschild learned his lesson and never fell for another con. Slack took his money and disappeared from view, never to be found. Arnold simply went home to Kentucky. After all, his sale of his mining rights had been legit. The buyers had taken the best advice, and if the mine had run out of diamonds, that was their problem. Arnold used the money to greatly enlarge his farm and open up a bank of his own. Keys to power. Keys to power. The feeling that someone else is more intelligent than we are is almost intolerable. We usually try to justify it in different ways. He only has book knowledge, where I have real knowledge. Her parents paid for her to get a good education. If my parents had as much money, if I had been as privileged, he's not as smart as he thinks. Last but not least, she may know her narrow little field she may know her narrow little field better than I do. But beyond that, she's really not smart at all. Even Einstein was a boob outside of physics. Given how important the idea of intelligence is to many people's vanity, it is critical it is critical never inadvertently to insult or impugn a person's brain power. That is an unforgivable sin. But if you can make this iron rule a bit of a moron, and you can run rings around them, the feeling of intellectual superiority you give them will disarm their suspicious muscles. In 1865, the Prussian counselor Otto von Bismarck wanted Austria to sign a certain treaty. The treaty was totally in the interest of Prussia and against the interests of Austria. And Bismarck would have to strategize to get the Austrians to agree to it. But the Austrian negotiator, Count Blum, was an avid card player. His particular game was quince. 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 And he often quince. Quince. Quinze. Quin. Come on, that's where you at, baby. Quinze. Not in there. His particular game was quince, and he often said that he could judge a man's character by the way he played quince. Bismarck knew of this saying of Blum's. The night before the negotiations were to begin, Bismarck innocently engaged Blum in a game of quince. The Prussian would later write that was the very last time I ever played quince. I had played so recklessly that everyone was astonished. I lost several thousand thalers, the currency of the time, but I succeeded in fooling Blum, for he believed me to be more venturesome than I am, and I gave away. Besides appearing reckless, Bismarck also played the witless fool, saying ridiculous things and bumbling about with a surplus of nervous energy. All this made Blum feel he had gathered valuable information. He knew that Bismarck was aggressive. The Prussian already had that or that reputation. And the way he played had confirmed it. An aggressive man, Blum knew, could be foolish and rash. Accordingly, when the time came to sign the treaty, Blum thought he had the advantage. A heelless fool like Bismarck, he definitely something. he failed to read the fine print. As soon as the ink was dry, a joyous Bismarck exclaimed in his face, "Well, I could never have believed that I should find an Austrian diplomat willing to sign that document." The Chinese have a phrase, masquerading as a swine to kill the tiger. This refers to an ancient hunting technique in which the hunter clothes himself in the hide and snout of a pig and mimics its grunting. The mighty tiger thinks a pig is coming his way and lets it get close, savoring the prospect of an easy meal. But it is the hunter who has the last laugh. Masquerading as a swine works wonders on those who, like tigers, are arrogant and overconfident. Masquerading like a swine works wonders on those who, like tigers, are arrogant and overconfident. The easier they think it is, to prey on you, and no one will believe you harbor dangerous ambitions. They may even promote you since you seem and subservient. Claudius, before he became emperor of Rome and the prince of France, who later became Louis XIII, used this tactic when those above them suspected they might have designs on the throne. By playing the fool as young men, they were left alone when the time came for them to strike and to act with vigor and decisiveness. They caught everyone off guard. Intelligence is the obvious. As Arnold and Slack knew, on the air of complete naivety can work wonders. An air of complete naivety can work wonders. Those fancy financiers who were laughing at them behind their backs, but who laughed loudest in the end. In general, they always make people believe they are smarter. In general, then always make people believe they are smarter and more sophisticated than you are. They will keep you around because you make them feel better about themselves. And the longer you are around, the more opportunities you will have to deceive them. Image, the opossum. In playing dead, the opossum plays stupid. Many a predator has therefore left it alone. Who could believe that such an ugly, unintelligent, nervous little creature could be capable of such deception? Authority. Image, the opossum playing dead. The possum plays stupid. Many of a predator has therefore left it alone. Who could believe that such an ugly, unintelligent, nervous little creature could be capable of such deception? Authority. Know how to make use of stupidity. The wisest man plays this card at times. There are occasions when the highest wisdoms consist in appearing not to know. You must not be ignorant, but capable of playing. It is not much good being wise among fools. Man, it is not much good being wise among fools and sane among lunatics. It is not much good being wise among fools and sane among lunatics. He who poses as a fool is not a fool, The best way to be well received by all is to clothe yourself in the skin of the dumbest brutes. Balthazar Gracian, 1601 to 1658. The reversal. To reveal the true nature of your intelligence rarely pays. You should get in the habit of downplaying it at all times. If people inadvertently learn the truth, that you are actually much smarter than you look, they will admire you more by being discreet than, they will, I'm going to go back. If people inadvertently learn the truth, that you are actually much smarter than you look, they will admire you more for being discreet than for making your brilliance show. At the start of your climb to the top, of course, you cannot play too stupid. You may want to let your bosses know in a subtle way that you are smarter than the competition around you. As you climb the ladder, however, you should to some degree try to dampen your brilliance. There is, however, one situation where it pays to do the opposite. When you can cover up a deception with a show of intelligence, it matters of smarts, as in most things, appearances are what count. It matters of smarts, as in most things, appearances are what count. If you seem to have authority and knowledge, people will believe what you say. If you seem to have authority and knowledge, people will believe what you say. A lot of that going on right now. They can be very useful in getting you up out of a scrape. The art dealer Joseph Devine was once attending a soiree at the New York home of the tycoon to whom he had recently sold the Dewey painting for a high price. Among the guests was a young French art critic who seemed extremely knowledgeable and confident. Wanting to impress this man, the tycoon's daughter showed him the Dewey, which had not yet been hung. The critic studied it for a time, then finally said, I don't think this Dewey is right. He followed the young woman as she hurried to tell her father what he had said. Experts here and in Europe have been taken into and have said that painting isn't genuine. And now you've made the same mistake. His confident tone and air of authority intimidated the Frenchman, who apologized for his mistake. Devine knew that the art market was flooded with fakes, and that many paintings had been falsely ascribed to old masters. He tried his best to distinguish the real from the fake, but in his zeal to sell, he often overplayed the work's authenticity. What mattered to him was that the buyer believed he had bought the Dewey, and that Devine himself convinced everyone of his expertness through his air of irreproachable authority. Thus, it was important to be able to play the professor when necessary and never impose such an attitude for its own sake. That was Law 21. Play the sucker to catch a sucker. Seem dumber than your mom. Law 22. Use the surrender tactic. Transform weakness into power. Use the surrender tactic. Transform weakness into power. When you are weaker, never fight for honor's sake. Choose surrender instead. Surrender gives you time to recover, time to torment and irritate your conqueror, time to wait for his power to wane. Do not give him the satisfaction of fighting and defeating you. Surrender first. By turning the other cheek, you infuriate and unsettle him. Make surrender a tool of power. By turning the other cheek, you infuriate and unsettle him. Transgression of the law. The island of Melos is strategically situated in the heart of the Mediterranean. In classical times, the city of Athens dominated the sea and coastal areas around Greece, but Sparta in the Peloponnese had been Melos' original colonizer. During the Peloponnesian War, then the Melians refused to ally themselves with Athens and remain loyal to Mother Sparta. In 416 BC, the Athenians sent the expedition against Melos. Before launching an all-out war, however, they dispatched a delegation to persuade the Melians to surrender and become an ally rather than suffer devastation and defeat. You know as well as we do, the delegates said, that the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel. And that, in fact, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. The strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. When the Melians responded that this denied the notion of fair play, the Athenians said that those in power determined what was fair and what was not. The Melians argued that this authority belonged to the gods, not to mortals. Our opinions of the gods and our knowledge of men, replied a member of the Athenian delegation, lead us to conclude that it is a general and necessary law of nature to rule whatever one can. The Melians would not budge. Sparta, they insisted, would come to their defense. The Athenians countered. The Athenians countered. I lost my place. The Athenians countered that the Spartans were conservative, practical people and would not help Melos because they had nothing to gain and a lot to lose by doing so. Finally, the Melians began to talk of honor and the principle of resisting brute force. Do not be led astray by a false sense of honor, said the Athenians. Honor often brings men to ruin when they are faced with an obvious danger that somehow affects their pride. There is nothing disgraceful in giving way to the greatest city in Hellas when she is offering you such reasonable terms. The debate ended. The Melians discussed the issue among themselves and decided to trust in the aid of the Spartans, the will of the gods, and the rightness of their cause. They politely declined the Athenians' offer. A few days later, the Athenians invaded Melos. The Melians fought nobly, even with the Spartans, who did not come to their rescue. It took several attempts before the Athenians could surround and besiege their main city, but the Melians finally surrendered. The Athenians wasted no time. They put to death all the men of military age that they could capture. They sold the women and children as slaves, and they repopulated the land with their own colonists. Damn. Only a handful of Malians survived. Interpretation. And they made the most practical argument that they could with the Malians. When you are weaker, there is nothing to be gained by fighting a useless fight. No one comes to help the weak. By doing so, they would only put themselves in jeopardy. The weak are alone and must submit. The weak are alone and must submit. The weak are alone and must submit. Fighting gives you nothing to gain but martyrdom. And in the process, a lot of people who do not believe in your cause will die. Weakness is no sin and can even become a strength if you learn how to play it right. Had the Malians surrendered in the first place, they would have been able to sabotage the Athenians in subtle ways, or might have gotten what they could have out of the alliance and then left it when the Athenians themselves were weakened, as in fact happened several years later. Fortunes change, and the mighty are often brought down. Surrender conceals great power. Lulling the enemy into complacency, it gives you time to recoup, time to undermine, time for revenge. Never sacrifice that time in exchange for Brecht became a convert to the cause of communism. From then on, his plays, essays, and poems reflected his revolutionary fervor, and he generally tried to make his ideological statements as clear as possible. When Hitler came to power in Germany, Brecht and his communist colleagues became marked men. He had many friends, German intellectuals who had fled Hitler. In 1941, accordingly, Brecht immigrated to the United States and chose to settle in Los Angeles, where he hoped to make a living in the film business. Over the next few years, Brecht wrote scripts with a pointedly anti-capitalist slant. He had little success in Holland, so in 1947, the war having ended, he decided to return to Europe. That same year, however, the U.S. Congress House UN American Activities Committee began its investigation into supposed communist infiltration into Hollywood. It began to gather information on Brecht, who had so exposed Marxism, and on September 19, 1947, only a month before he had planned to leave the United States, he received a subpoena. Why I didn't know I pronounced that. A subpoena to appear before the committee. In addition to Brecht, a number of other writers, producers, and directors were summoned to appear as well, and this group came to be known as the Hollywood 19. Before going to Washington, the Hollywood 19 met to decide on a plan of action. Their approach would be confrontational. Instead of answering questions about their membership or lack of it, the communist or a lack of it in the Communist Party, they would read prepared statements that would challenge the authority of the committee and argue that its activities were unconstitutional. Even if this strategy meant imprisonment, it would gain publicity for their cause. Brecht disagreed. What good was it, he asked, to play the martyr and gain a little public sympathy if in the process they lost the ability to stage their plays and sell their scripts for years to come? He felt certain they were all more intelligent than the members of the committee. Why lower themselves to the level of their opponents by arguing with them? Why not fox the committee by appearing to surrender to it while subtly mocking it? The Hollywood 19 listened to Brecht politely, but decided to stick to their plan, leaving Brecht to go his own way. The committee finally summoned Brecht on October the 30th. They expected him to do what others among the Hollywood 19 who had testified before him had done: argue, refuse to answer questions, challenge the committee's right to hold its hearing, even yell and hurl insults. Much to their surprise, however, Brecht was the very picture of congeniality. He wore a suit, something he rarely did, smoked a cigar. He had heard that the committee chairman was a passionate cigar smoker, answered the question politely, and generally deferred to their authority. Unlike the other witnesses, Brecht answered the question of whether he belonged to the Communist Party. He was not a member, he said, which happened to be the truth. One committee member asked him, "Is it true when you have written a number of revolutionary is it true you have written a number of revolutionary plays?" Brecht had written many plays with overt communist messages, but he responded, "I have written a number of poems and songs and plays in the fight against Hitler, and of course, they had been considered, therefore, as revolutionary. Because I, of course, was for the overthrow of that government." This statement went unchallenged. Brecht's English was more than adequate, but he used an interpreter throughout his testimony, a tactic that allowed him to play subtle games with language. That's why people who can't speak other languages want them to speak the common language in that area, so they can't play these games. So they can't do what Brecht was trying to do. Brecht's English was more than adequate, but he used an interpreter throughout this testimony, a tactic that allowed him to play subtle games with language. When committee members found communist leanings in lines from English editions of his poems, he would repeat the lines in German for the interpreter, who would then retranslate it, and somehow they would come out innocuous. Innocuous. I've heard that. Innocuous. 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 Innocous. Innocuous. Not actively harmful. Calculated to give no offense. Lacking force. Calculated to give no offense. I think that's it. When committee members found communist leanings in the lines from English editions of his poems, he would repeat the lines in German for the interpreter, who would then retranslate them, and somehow they would come out calculated to give no offense. They would come out not actively harmful or innocuous. At one point, a committee member read one of Brecht's revolutionary poems out loud in English and asked him if he had written it. "No," he responded. "I wrote a German poem, which is very different from this. The author's elusive answers baffled the committee members, but his politeness and the way he yielded to their authority made it impossible for them to get angry with him. After only an hour of questioning, the committee members had had enough. "Thank you very much," said the chairman. "You are a good example to the other witnesses." Not only did they free him, they offered to help if he had any trouble with immigration officials who might detain him for their own reasons. The following day, Brecht left the United States, never to return. Ran off on the plug twice. The Hollywood 19's confrontational approach won them a lot of sympathy, and years later they gained a kind of vindication in public opinion. But they were also blacklisted and lost valuable years of profitable working time. Brecht, on the other hand, expressed his disgust at the committee more indirectly. It was not that he changed his beliefs or compromised his values. Instead, during his short testimony, he kept the upper hand by appearing to yield, while all the time running circles around the committee with vague responses, outright lies that went unchallenged because they were wrapped in enigmas, the word game. In the end, he kept the freedom to continue his revolutionary writings, as opposed to suffering imprisonment or detainment in the United States, even while subtly mocking the committee and its authority with his pseudo-obedience. Keep in mind the following people. Keep in mind the following. People trying to make a show of their authority are easily deceived by the surrender tactic. Your outward sign of submission makes them feel important. Satisfied that you respect them, they become easier targets for later counterattack or for the kind indirect ridicule used by Brecht. Measuring your power over time, never sacrifice long-term maneuverability for the short-term lived glories of martyrdom. Measuring your power over time, never sacrifice long-term maneuverability for the short-lived glories of martyrdom. When the great Lord passes, the wise peasant bows deeply and silently farts. Ethiopian proverb. Ethiopian proverb. When the great Lord passes, the wise peasant bows deeply and silently farts. You know? Keys to power. What gets us into trouble in the realm of power is often our own overreaction to the moves of our enemies and rivals. That overreaction creates problems we would have avoided had we been more reasonable. It also had an endless rebound effect, for the enemy then overreacts as well, much as the Athenians did to the Melians. It is always our first instinct to react, to meet aggression with some other kind of aggression. But the next time someone pushes you, you find yourself starting to react. Try this. Do not resist or fight back, but yield. Turn the other cheek. Then you will find that this often neutralizes their behavior. They expected, even wanted you to react with force, and so they are caught off guard and confounded by your lack of resistance. Next time someone pushes you and you find yourself starting to react, try this. Do not resist or fight back, but yield. Turn the other cheek, bend. You will find that this often neutralizes their behavior. They expected, even wanted you to react with force, and so they are caught off guard and confounded by your lack of resistance. By yielding, by yielding, you in fact control the situation because your surrender is part of a larger plan to lure them into believing they have defeated you. This is in the opponents will often be bewildered instead, and they are unlikely to react with more violence, which would demand a reaction from you. Instead, you are allowed the time and space to plot the counter moves that will bring them down. In the battle of intelligence against the brutal and the aggressive, the surrender tactic is the supreme weapon. It does require self-control. It does require self-control. Those who genuinely surrender give up their freedom. And those who genuinely surrender give up their freedom and may be crushed. You have to remember that you only appear to surrender, like the animal that plays dead to save its hide. You have seen that it can be better to surrender than to fight. With a more powerful opponent and a sure defeat, it is often as also better to surrender than to run away. Running away may save you for a time being, but the aggressor will eventually catch up with you. If you surrender instead, you have an opportunity to coil around your enemy and strike with your fangs from close up. In 473 BC, in ancient China, King Gao Zhuang of Yi suffered a horrible defeat from the ruler of Wu in the Battle of Fuzhou. Gao Zhuang wanted to flee, but he had an advisor who told him to surrender and to place himself in the service of the ruler of Wu, for which position he could study the man and plot his revenge. Deciding to follow this advice, Gao Zhuang gave the ruler all of his riches and went to work in his conqueror's stables as the lowest servant. For 3 years, he humbled himself before the ruler, who then, finally satisfied of his loyalty, allowed him to return home. Inwardly, however, Gao Zhuang he raised an army, invaded, and won with ease. That is the power behind surrender. It gives you the time and the flexibility to plot a devastating counterblow. Had Gao Zhuang run away, he would have lost this chance. When foreign trade began to threaten Japanese independence in the mid-19th century, the Japanese debated how to defeat the foreigners. One minister, Hoda Masayoshi, wrote a memorandum in 1857 that influenced Japanese policy for years to come. I am therefore convinced that our policy should be to conclude friendly alliances, to send ships to foreign countries everywhere and conduct trade, to copy the foreigners where they are at their best, and so repay our own shortcomings, to foster our national strength, to complete our ornaments, and so gradually subject the foreigners to our influence until in the end all the countries of the world know the blessings and perfect tranquility and our hegemony as acknowledged throughout the globe. This is a brilliant application of the law. You surrender to gain access to your enemy. You surrender to gain access to your enemy. Learn his ways. Insinuate yourself with him slowly. Insinuate yourself with him slowly. Outwardly conform to his customs, but inwardly maintain your own culture. Eventually, you will emerge victorious. For while he considers you weak and inferior, this soft, permeable form of invasion is often the best, for the enemy has nothing to react against, prepare for, or resist. Had Japan resisted Western influence by force, it might well have suffered a devastating invasion that would have permanently altered its culture. Surrender can also offer a way of mocking your enemies, of turning their power against him, as it did to Brett. Milan Kundera's novel, The Joke, based on an author's experiences in a penal camp in Czechoslovakia, tells the story of how the prison guards organized a relay race, guards against prisoners. For the guards, this was a chance to show off their physical superiority. The prisoners knew they were expected to lose, so they went out of their way to oblige, miming exaggerated jogging over so slowly while the guards raced ahead at full speed, both by joining the race and by losing it. They had obliged the guards obediently, but their over obedience had mocked the event to the point of ruining it. Over obedience, surrender was here a way to demonstrate superiority in the reverse manner. Resistance would have engaged the prisoners in a cycle of violence, lowering them to the guards' level. Over obeying the guards, however, ridiculous. Yet they could not rightly punish the prisoners, who had only done what they asked. Power is always in flux. Power is always in flux. Since the game is by nature fluid and an arena of constant struggle, those with power almost always find themselves eventually on the downward swing. If you find yourself temporarily weakened, the surrender tactic is perfect for raising yourself up again. It disguises your ambition. It teaches you patience and self-control, key skills in the game. And it puts you in the best position, the best possible position for taking advantage of your oppressor's sudden slide. If you run away or fight back, in the long run, you cannot win. If you surrender, you will almost always emerge victorious. Image: an oak tree. The oak that resists the wind loses its branches, one by one. And with nothing left to protect it, the trunk finally snaps. The oak that bends lives longer, its trunk growing wider, its roots deeper and more tenacious. Authority. You have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat. Let them have thy coat, thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Jesus Christ in Matthew 5, chapter 5, verse 31 through 38 through 41. Reversal. The point of surrendering is to save your hide for a later date, and martyrdom seems the only way out. Furthermore, if you are willing to die, others may gain power and inspiration from your example. Yet martyrdom surrenders. Yet martyrdom surrenders reversal is a messy. In the aggression it combats. For every famous martyr, there are thousands more who have inspired neither a religion nor a rebellion. So that if martyrdom does sometimes grant a certain power, it does so unpredictably. More important, you will not be around to enjoy the power, such as it is. And there is finally something selfish and arrogant about martyrs, as if they felt their followers were less important than their own glory. When power deserts you, it is best to ignore the law's reversal. Leave martyrdom alone. The pendulum will swing back your way eventually, and you should stay alive to see it. And that was Law 22. Use the surrender tactic. Transform weakness into power. Next time we come back, we'll do Law 23 and Law 24. Law 23, concentrate your forces. And Law 24, play the perfect courtier. Play the perfect courtier. Well, man, that's your boy Shallow, reading the 48 laws of power, 2 laws at a time. The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, a Joyce Elfer's book. Law 23 and 24 coming up. Man, shalom, shalom, everybody. Man. If y'all have any suggestions on other books, man, feel free. Leave them in the comments. You know, I'm gonna work with what I got. And we'll see what's up on the suggestions. Shalom. And we'll see what's up on the suggestions. Hit me up in the comments.